I want to welcome everyone here today, especially those of you watching on our live stream. It was late last night that I first heard that Andrew Yang had decided to depart the Democratic Party and start a third party. And I want to officially applaud him for this effort. I think I can empathize with the situation that he's gone through as an outsider in the process, both during the presidential campaign, but more specifically in this recent mayoral bid that he made in the Democratic primary. Oftentimes his ideas were new, they were innovative, they were outside the box, and they were jeered, not cheered, by the professional political establishment in the Democratic Party, and even by some who were to the far, far left, who disparaged Andrew Yang. I think probably he was most upset by the way he was treated by the eventual Democratic primary winner, Eric Adams, who at times described him as being a fraud, a liar, and a racist. And I think what I heard Eric Adams actually say on Juneteenth, that because Catherine Garcia and Andrew Yang had decided to partner up as part of the whole way that ranked choice voting works, that effort on their part was an act of racism, making Andrew Yang a racist. And I scratched my head and said, Andrew Yang, racist? He's an Asian man, right? What is he, racist? Because he decides to do what ranked choice voting was actually created to do. And I know that, having been a proponent of ranked choice voting when I was the New York State Reform Party chairman. And I had gone out in front and promoted it in the initiative and referendum where it passed handily before city voters by a vote of about 70 to 30. And the whole idea, the whole concept, if you've watched ranked choice voting over the country, is that people who would normally be sparring amongst one another would actually team up, giving the voters an opportunity to see them in an adversarial position, but also in sharing some of the same values and the same principles. So I applauded Andrew Yang at that time and Catherine Garcia for actually taking advantage of what ranked choice voting was meant to potentially do. We saw Eric Adams, he had more than an equal opportunity to partner up with, there was 13 people running in the Democratic primary. He chose not to, and that was his choice. But to disparage Andrew Yang as he did, calling him a fraud, a liar, especially a racist, had to really have a very negative effect. And I know it certainly did on his many supporters, the Yang Gang, of whom I've come across on many occasions out on the campaign trail. In fact, out of all the people I've come across and their supporters who are running for the Democratic primary, they always seem to want to engage the most. As their leader of the Yang Gang, Yang himself was a happy warrior. He always seemed to exude a positive attitude, even when some of the things he was introducing into the jargon of the campaign seemed not to be on the traditional path. The Yang Gang, I've had many conversations with since. I come across them all the time. They're always wanting to see what I'm doing in my own campaign, and in some respects, there are some similarities to what Andrew Yang has gone through and what I am going through in this campaign. As Andrew Yang was not accepted by the professional politicians in his own party, the Democrats, he was considered the outsider, the new guy, the guy who had never actually held a political office. I obviously share some of that same background. Many people know that I won the Republican primary handily, but many of my adversaries within the party said Curtis Sliwa is not a Republican. He's a never-Trumper. And they spent, $1.5 million, my opponent, Fernando Mateo, to get that message across to the voters. The voters did not accept that message and elected me overwhelmingly to be their candidate. And in the discourse that took place in the Democratic primary, I saw some of the values being espoused by Andrew Yang as being some that I myself was positively in favor of. I remember Andrew Yang was the first to say, let's tax Columbia University. Let's tax NYU. Let's tax Madison Square Garden, especially Columbia and NYU sitting on endowments, as Columbia has, of $11 billion. NYU of $4 billion. They buy up properties throughout Morningside Heights. That's what Columbia does. NYU and Greenwich Village. In fact, sometimes you go to Greenwich Village, you think half of Greenwich Village is owned by NYU, and it's taken off the property tax rolls. And he went right at Jimmy Dolan, obnoxious as Jimmy Dolan has always been, and said, you need to pay your fair share of property taxes, even though that was put into place long before the Dolan family owned Madison Square Garden and their other entities. It's been a carryover. And I immediately took that message of Andrew Yang and said, well, what I would do is I would tax those same entities, but would have a specialized tax and use that money specifically for the hiring of 3,000 additional police officers, their recruitment, their vetting, their training in College Point, taking off on the old safe street, safe city approach that David Dinkins and Peter Vallone Sr. had put into place before Rudy Giuliani was elected mayor in 1993. And in fact, it got the police department up to 38,000, enabling Rudy to get law and order back into the city structure. So we went from being what was the most dangerous city in America, the murder capital of America, into the safest big city in America. So I applauded Andrew Yang then for being the first to take that position, and I applaud him now because it was a common sense position. The other area that I had agreement with Andrew Yang had to do with UBI, Universal Basic Income, although we differ in its aspects. And many in the Yang gang immediately said, oh, Curtis Sliwa was actually thinking about this as a possibility, whereas many of Yang's opponents in the Democratic primary completely shut out the idea. And they were open to discourse. They didn't just say it's our way or the highway. It's the Yang way, because Yang wanted to give $1,000 to people with no restrictions on a regular basis, a monthly basis. He had a plan and how he would do that if he would have become mayor of the city of New York. I've opted to say, wait, let's experiment with that, because there are conservatives and libertarians, many who were guided by Milton Friedman, who is considered the modern-day godfather of supply-side economics, a libertarian from Chicago University, very conservative, considered the #1 capitalist of his time, who actually said, hey, we want to try to undo this huge social service bureaucracy that swallows up most of the money that should be going to the people in need. So conservatives and libertarians have thought of it. Yang actually extrapolated on it to make it a primary issue, first in the Democratic presidential primary, and then obviously in the mayoral election. The Yang gang and many progressives and liberals believe that UBI, Universal Basic Income, you should do because it's the humanitarian thing to do, and you should trust people. People to spend the money as they see fit, as opposed to politicians telling them how to do that. And I think there we linked in on those principles of trusting people, not politicians. Once again, we're both outsiders in that respect. And there are a number of other issues that Andrew Yang had touched on that I found synergy with. And in fact, I'll soon be sitting down with the Yang gang itself and to discuss what other areas we may have an agreement or disagreement or we see halfway. But I think Andrew Yang needs to be applauded for injecting a positive sense into this campaign that was clearly lacking. And his desire to create a third party, I can only tell him, having been chairman of a third party here in New York, the New York State Reform Party for 3 years, that there are always going to be forces that are going to try to impede your development. We saw that with former Governor Andrew Cuomo, who decided single-handedly to go to war against the Working Families Party because they had not endorsed him in his recent gubernatorial run. They had endorsed Cynthia Nixon. So he took a solemn vow to eliminate them. And in doing so, he raised the threshold of what independent third parties needed in order to qualify as online ballot parties. And in the process of raising the threshold, only the conservatives survived. The Working Families Party, to their credit, actually became stronger as a result of his constant attacks and his constant attempt to neuter them and render them impotent. They survived. But unfortunately, the Green Party did not. The Libertarian Party did not. The Independence Party did not. The New York State Reform Party, which I was chairman of, did not. And other third parties. They were wiped out. So if Andrew Yang is bringing this third party idea into New York State, it's badly needed. I encourage third parties, and always have, as an independent for most of my life. And he'll probably be attempting to take this on a national level, where third parties are desperately needed, because oftentimes you hear only the voices of the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and the third parties are virtually out of sight, out of mind. So I hope he would use his enormous national profile and the profile he has in the city of New York to be able to pursue his goal. I'm looking forward to actually seeing what his concepts are in the book that he's having released. It'll be published on October 1st, which is titled Forward, Notes on the Future of Our Democracy, which at times, let's face it, our democracy has been in peril, whether you look at it from a Democratic perspective or a Republican perspective, or as I have done for most of my life, as an independent perspective. I think the other thing that Andrew Yang needs to be applauded for is when he was in the mix of the Democratic primary involving 13 candidates, you saw an enormous focus, a priority focus, on the Asian hate crimes that were being committed in our city. Because clearly, as a prominent Asian candidate, when he would speak at a forum, everybody would listen. And he engaged everybody on this issue. He prioritized this issue. Ever since he's been removed from the primary process, he removed himself. He didn't go through the entirety of the ranked choice process. You notice we haven't had any rallies. Haven't been any big, momentous movements to bring people together against the continued Asian hate crimes. I know I myself have continued in that same passion to protect Asians in this city, both as leader of the Guardian Angels long before there was the political process or I announced, and most recently when we saw that mother on Canal Street in Broadway dragged down the stairs. She was with her son. She was from Burma, and she developed hemorrhaging in the brain and then eventually died in Bellevue. There were no elected officials out there. There were no rallies. There were no programs denouncing Asian hate. We put a $20,000 reward for the capture of the suspect, who everybody could see was clearly on camera. You got a perfect profile. They even know the background of the suspect, who originally had resided in a shelter in Harlem. But nothing more has been done. It hasn't been prioritized. When Andrew Yang was in the race, every attack on an Asian, focus, priority, let's see what we can do, and the other Democrats rallied around him, and obviously Republicans too. So again, I've had to sort of carry on with the absence of Andrew Yang, because you don't really see anybody, even running for local office, talking about that any longer. It no longer seems to be a priority. So to Andrew Yang and to the Yang Gang, I clearly found that there was a lot that we had in common. Just to give you an idea, in the many places I go, and I don't think there's any candidate out in the mayoral campaign who goes to as many places I go. In fact, as a Republican and the independent candidate, I go into neighborhoods where they haven't seen a Republican since Abraham Lincoln on a $5 bill. But I remember in the early part of the campaign, there was the grand reopening of Coney Island. And this was really a significant act in the comeback of New York City, because Coney Island had been shut down completely, locked down. The rides were closed. All you could do is go to the beach, and even briefly, remember, you couldn't even go swimming. I defied the mayor, and on Memorial Day, I went swimming and dared him to have me arrested, but of course, it was all bluster. But the fact is that Coney Island had basically no longer ceased to exist. And then all of a sudden, it was the grand reopening. And most of the Democratic candidates running for mayor were there. Obviously, I was there. I'm the Coney Island kid. And as I went from entourage to entourage, I remember some of the members of the various candidates' entourages were flipping me the bird. Oh, that's a Trumper. That's a Republican. Don't go near him. You might catch their disease. I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm not a Trumper. By the way, there is elections. There's a democratic process. And the only people who were civil were the Yang Gang and Andrew Yang himself. I remember we were walking up onto the boardwalk, and I saw Andrew Yang was conducting a press conference, and he had a large gathering of reporters. And I and some of the guardian angels who were with me, we stayed in the distance. We were respected. Nobody from the entourage thought we were going to try to bum rush their press conference. And he was making some really good points about beach erosion, about maintaining the beach, and the glories of Coney Island, even though I recognized, like myself, he wasn't born and raised here in New York City. So that was the kind of energy, that was the kind of positive message he was getting out as the happy warrior. And it's unfortunate what happened to him in the Democratic primary process, especially at the hands of Eric Adams, who single-handedly decided to go out of his way to disparage Andrew Yang. Every time he would go into an inner-city neighborhood, Eric Adams was calling him an interloper, a snake oil salesman, because he was bringing the concept of UBI into the inner city. And I said to myself, why disparage him? Debate the issue. If you have policies of your own, reveal them to those who would vote in the Democratic primary, but why immediately dismiss him as he did, and then eventually calling him a liar, a fraud, and a racist? So I hope down the road to meet with Andrew Yang. I think there's a lot of synergy between what he has stood for as an outsider, what I've certainly stood for as an outsider 67 of my years, and most importantly in my run to become the mayor of the city of New York. But I wish him goodwill. I wish his supporters goodwill. They'll obviously have the choice of whether they're going to follow in the footsteps of Yang as he begins a really difficult process of creating a valid third party locally and nationally, and hope to engage them in discourse to talk about what we agree about, what we disagree about, in a synergistic way. So I don't know what the other electeds have said about Andrew Yang's departure from their party, or those that were adversaries of him during the primary, but I think we can all agree, both in the run-up to the Democratic presidential primary that gave us Joe Biden, who eventually became our president, and both in the very long and grinding Democratic primary process decided by ranked choice voting. I thought Andrew Yang stood head and shoulders above the other candidates in the way he handled himself. He was the happy warrior. He brought a positive light. He could be self-deprecating. You don't really see that with the other candidates. He could have a good belly laugh. He could recognize that he made a mistake and immediately be willing to apologize instead of acting omnipotent and pretentious like so many others. So good luck, Andrew Yang. Good luck, Yang Gang, because you keep your idealistic viewpoints. That's the one thing I've seen of many of these young men and women all over the 5 boroughs of the city of New York, is that they have had tremendous idealistic attitudes. Their ideas and their authenticity have struck me as being very sincere. They're not cronies, they're not lackeys, they're not sycophants of the old Democratic political process that has given us Cuomo, out the door he went, de Blasio, the worst mayor in my lifetime, who was taking a Miley Cyrus wrecking ball to the city that we love, and Eric Adams, who's like a combination of Cuomo and de Blasio 2.0. So this is the kind of energy, this is the kind of spirit, this is the kind of forensic debate that we really need in the mayoral process. And I'm really very pleased that Andrew Yang is going to remain very relevant by starting a third party, and wish him the best and his followers the best.